Boston American Statesman, saying that he's meeting by Zoom with Big 12 people who are in Greenbrier, deciding on further Big 12 expansion, etc. So the scuttlebutt is out there. Whether it comes to it or not, I guess we'll see. But this would be maybe the start of the most interesting time when it comes to realignment.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, what do you classify as most interesting? Just this chapter?
Like the when it would happen kind of a time.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that where that comment's coming from, given they're on their way out, and how privy are they to what's actually being talked about in regards to the Big 12's future. I don't know how much crossover there is there. Certainly, though, it wouldn't be surprising if Joe Castiglione had a pretty good idea of what was going on, whether or not he was behind closed doors. But I also saw that I would like to see the full quote on that, because the way that he's quoted there, then Kirk adds on as they're talking about expansion, but that wasn't in the quote. Yeah. So I don't know if Kirk added that on or if that's just like the rest of what Joe said. And if that's the case, if Joe said it, it's far more interesting, because he's outright saying they're talking about this. Now, then again, regardless, we kind of know that they're talking about that. I mean, I don't think there's been any secret that they've had discussions for the entire last year. They are going to continue to have discussions. We've had Baylor AD Mac Rhodes on this show multiple times. He's usually a weekly guest, but this week he's obviously busy and can't join us, and that happens from time to time. But, I mean, I think we've talked about it as much as any place in America, and he's talked about it as openly as any AD in America. So I don't think that's a surprise in any way, shape, or form, that news that they're talking about, potential realignment. But I get that because of the Colorado stuff, that maybe it seems like more of like, oh, my gosh, like they're talking about realignment. So that's understandable, and yeah, it makes for some interesting times, because there is now this twist in the wind of the PAC talks, and the kind of sort of where we are with that, and where we've been the last few weeks is not necessarily where we're headed now, because there wasn't a whole lot of momentum behind Colorado these last few weeks. There wasn't a whole lot of like, yeah, this Pac-12 is really done. I mean, I know there was people that said that, but that was as much, I think, trolling as anything else a lot of the time. Now, because of, what Max has reported and what others have put out there, there does seem to be this week like there's a little bit of a turning of the tide. And, I don't know if that leads to what everybody seems to think it's going to lead to, but it is very interesting, and it does feel like we're sort of closing in on some decisions being made, and how much longer, can you go on as an entity like Colorado, whoever else may be weighing their options, with the waiting game before you decide, like, hey, we got to do something. As Rick George said last week, we'd love to stay here, but we got to ultimately do what's best for us. So at what point do they feel like they have to make that move and do what's best for them? And that's what we don't know. But, yeah, Colorado, there's a lot of heat around them right now. And if you're a Big 12 fan, then, you feel like there's probably a little bit of blood in the water. But I don't know if it's, locked in just yet. So I'm being kind of cautious with the whole thing of, I think there's legitimately a chance this happens, but I also think that, maybe there's a miracle on the way. I'm not quite ready to read the Pac-12 its last rites like some are so ready to do right now.
Yeah, I do think that, you hear different theories. Like, I could buy in more, like Tim Fitzgerald posed an interesting one to me in that, maybe the Pac-12, because they know they're not going to get a deal, is just waiting for someone like Colorado to bolt so they can say, well, they didn't wait for the deal, and then it's not necessarily on the league to have, pushed Colorado out. It's just Colorado wasn't patient enough, if that's how they want to spin it. But then you hear, we had Karen Brodkin on yesterday from Endeavor, and the way she said, look, big, Brett Yormark has big plans. Again, that's for a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But I do think that expansion is the biggest of those plans, and he's made no bones about that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's Colorado. Maybe you push, like, if Colorado gets to the brink and decides to go back to the Pac-12, that's when you get serious about other people who won't be in that mess. I don't know. So
yeah, I saw, I think his name's Aaron Torres. I just want to make sure that that's the right person out of the tweet. But they were talking about, the idea, and I thought it was actually, I think we maybe touched on it kind of, but not in full like this, but was talking about the expansion piece with basketball in particular. And, there's also a lot of stuff floating around about, the talks regarding UConn and the talks regarding Gonzaga and the basketball side of these things. And the fact that the Big 12 and Brett Yormark have made it known that basketball is a priority, that they think basketball is undervalued and that there's more money to be made there, and they're going to go play some, have practice exhibitions in New York City and do all sorts of different things, moving forward. And, you wonder, like, okay, well, what's the piece of, if you bring in UConn, you bring in Gonzaga, like, where do they fit into the grand scheme of things? And, as he pointed out, if you think that is an undervalued, sport in so many ways, but you're also wondering, like, where do we fit in this next wave? Well, you're not going to stack up team for team football-wise.
Yeah.
Big brand-wise football, you're not going to be able to match the SEC or the Big Ten at the moment. And you may never be able to pound for pound stack up with the top tier of those teams. Although I think some years that, maybe not the SEC, but the Big Ten, that I think that the Big 12 could probably have a pretty good little fight. But you look at the basketball side of things, and it's the number 2 sport. And maybe that's where they fit in. And that's kind of what arrows have pointed at for a long time. And I just haven't heard it put the way that he kind of put it, of Gonzaga and UConn, and you bring in those brands and you add them to Kansas and to Baylor and to Tech and to whoever. And it's like, yeah, you may not be able to be pound for pound number 1 in football, but you can be a really solid number 3. And then you can be a very solid number 1 or 1B or whatever in basketball, and look at yourself now and you're in pretty good shape. And so I hadn't really heard it put that way, but that makes a lot of sense. And so, there's that part of this as well. But yeah, a lot of the heat right now is around Colorado. Again, don't know if we're anywhere close to some decision being made. It's not like there's a countdown in 10 days we'll know something one way or the other. There's just a lot of stuff floating out there, but it has ramped up. And there's, I think, far fewer people going there's nothing's going to happen here. I think even some of those folks are like, okay, wait a second. This is going on long enough now where maybe, just maybe, there is something happening here. So yeah, it's all very interesting.
If you had to grade me on where I've been throughout this process, if you would have told me a year ago I was at 90-10, I'm like, look, they'll get something done, and then let's have this talk again in 5 years. And then each time this thing has gotten kicked down the road, I've been 10% shoved into the other direction of, I don't know, man. I mean, it doesn't seem like the Pac-12 is making good decisions. And I would just tell you, from someone who lived it, and Craig and I and everybody in the studio probably has a maybe different perspective than a lot, because we lived it a couple times here in Big 12 country where we've seen it, everything gets shaken up. And I'm just looking at what's going on in the Pac-12 and seeing what I've seen before in the Big 12 here, where, you get down to it, there's no resolving certain issues without people leaving or without, and that was here in the Big 12. There's no, the television contract just seems like they're boxed in on where they have to go and what they expect level by level, whatever that is, plus, what is actually available to them. Kind of reminds me of the decisions that everybody had to make when it came to Nebraska, Colorado, Missouri, and A&M leaving the Big 12. When they did was, well, the Longhorn Network wasn't going to go anywhere. That wasn't going to get renegotiated into a Big 12 network. It wasn't going to do this. Particularly Nebraska and Texas A&M just had huge problems with the way that Texas was unilaterally seemingly making decisions for the whole league, and they had enough. Nebraska not nearly as long as A&M, but A&M was finally in a position to be able to do something about it, as where previous attempts to separate themselves or take more of a leadership role in college athletics in the state had been thwarted by the fact that A&M was fairly new to being a big-time school and not just an all-male military school. So when they had that opportunity, they took it. It just seems to me that you're getting to those things where those points where people have to make decisions, and it may not be the decision that makes incredibly the most sense on the surface, but we're not in those rooms, right? So
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just think that there's only. It feels like probably for some there's so many seats that are open, right? And you got to feel like you got to grab a seat before the doors close and you are left out in the cold. And I think that, maybe there's some of that feeling with, some schools who feel like there's that gap, and then that gap's only going to get increasingly worse if they don't make a move of some kind. I think that's probably what Brett Yormark's pitching is hey, we're going to be a solid number 3. And, and it's not like this is a done deal or anything like that. I mean, it's still very much in so many ways in the same place it has been. But, yeah, the conversation has definitely changed from, I don't know, like September and then again in November and then in February. And, all throughout that time, we were supposed to hear of some sort of a deal at some point, and here we are, and it's freaking June 1st. I mean, and I know, like, there's nothing due. It's not in a rush to get done, but clearly it kind of is in some ways because some folks who are depending on that are getting a little bit antsy, clearly. I mean, that's something you can't deny. You can say till you're blue in the face that nothing is still going to happen. That's fine, but you can't deny that there is at least – the chatter that's ongoing, and it's not just the chatter of that you dismiss of like, oh, well, that's just how it's done. There's conversations that are, dude, we've reached a point past that. Like, come on now. Every single major outlet is talking about this. Every single person in college athletics practically is talking about realignment in the last couple of days. So it's not just this casual nothing's going to actually come of it type of conversation. Maybe that's what it was in like last August or something. Maybe that's what it was in October. Maybe that's what it was in March. But, I mean, it's June 1st now. So what are we talking about? It's not just nothing. And so very curious as to, what the next steps are as far as what could possibly, move this on down the line. I have seen a lot of Pac fans who are like, well, go ahead and take the worst schools that we have. That's totally fine. And I get, like, everybody's going to have their reactions one way or the other to it, but I do think that, they're going to have the opportunity with expansion one way or the other. Like, I still think you feel great if you're San Diego State that you're going to have a spot somewhere. I don't know about SMU. I think you're probably a bit more 50-50 on what the future looks like. And I don't know, like, I guess your percentages would increase with schools leaving more than with them staying. But that's going to be very curious to see how this continues to develop, because there's clearly a lot of rumblings behind the scenes that are more than just rumor mill type of stuff at this point. There's conversations taking place, and we'll talk to Max about more of what he's heard and learned about. But yeah, it's just very interesting how this roller coaster has maneuvered along, and now here we are, and right before media days. It's going to be interesting to hear some of these guys at their media days talking about some of what these subjects have been and having to answer some of those questions. And we've heard the pockets of Kirk Schultz and Rick George and all of that, and they've had their say these last few months, but pretty soon we're going to have to hear some more, and I'm curious as to what that be, if it'll be the same message of we're standing together, or if there's a little bit more of that door being left open. But yeah, you're in a weird spot right now if you're a certain number of schools.
By the way, the schools that are